All right, moving into groundwater, you might notice there's a bit of a different scenery behind me. That's because as I was exporting the video the first time I recorded everything, it corrupted and failed and closed and didn't save any autosaved files. So everything prior to this is a different file, and this is going to go on with the separate files so that it doesn't do that again. And I don't weep in a corner because it's failed to export. So thank you for bearing with me. Let's talk about groundwater. First off, we know that it is a major storage facility in the hydrologic cycle. It's also a critical resource in really tough shape. These are the two main focal points that we're going to kind of continue with for the rest of the lecture here. So it's a main resource. 40 times more groundwater exists than liquid surface water. So that's water that's underground, tough to get at, but fresh water, 40 times more of it. Now, in the general scheme of things, if we look, groundwater is 30% of 2.5%, right? So somewhere around 0.8% of the total water supply on our planet is groundwater, which is 40 times more than the amount of liquid surface water on the planet. Making some key distinctions here when we're talking about groundwater, we're going to talk about a couple of different things. We're going to talk about the water table, which is just the upper surface of the groundwater. It's a tabular surface, hence water table. Basically, above the water table is the vadose zone or the unsaturated zone. Below the water table is the groundwater zone. It's just that boundary between the two. So it's the top of our groundwater table, or our groundwater zone, pardon me. Groundwater is the water beneath the water table. So that water in our little diagram here. So water and the water table is expressed in a few different ways on the surface. It can be expressed as perennial ponds and streams and rivers. So where the water table intersects the surface, we have base flow conditions in streams, or we've got a pond or a lake that is there all year long. These are just expressions of our water table on the surface. Then we have situations where the water table might be below the surface, and those ponds or streams can dry out if water is dropped far enough. So that contact point that we see in this little line right here and this little line right here drive how that water is expressed on our surface. It also follows seasonal trends. Here we can see our water table linked very well to our precipitation. Now, there's also a little bit of a lag time, right? Because it takes time for water to infiltrate through the soil and down into the groundwater zone. So you can see there's a little bit of a lag here and a little bit of a lag here from that peak rainfall to the peak elevation within the water table. It also roughly imitates the topography of the landscape. We can see that through the line here where it intersects the surface. Well, that's where we have rivers or ponds. It also flows from higher to lower elevations, even underground, subsurface. So we can look at these two dots from H1 or height 1 to height 2, and water is flowing downhill in these examples. Now that we know some of the ways that groundwater moves and functions, let's talk a little bit more about some of the characteristic features within the groundwater system. So we can define our groundwater as water beneath the surface that is beyond the soil root zone, so the extent that plant roots get to. It's a major source of potable water. I would heavily suggest you look at that link that I have provided here on the slide. It'll be available on Canvas. And this is a way for you to actually make your own system, or you can pick some of the pre-constructed ones and actually look at how water is flowing through the subsurface. It's a really, really cool resource to be able to look at areas that are more permeable or less permeable, and what that means for how water moves through and congregates and sinks and reservoirs within our subsurface. So go ahead and give that a look and on your own time. It'll be nice to help kind of put those topics that we've been discussing into a little bit better context. So the groundwater system is basically an expression of water in the lithosphere, so the ground beneath our feet. One of the main attributes of that is an aquifer. It's a place in the hydrologic cycle where water is temporarily stored within the lithosphere. We see a bunch of different examples of aquifers on the little graph to the right, mainly a confined aquifer and an unconfined aquifer. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those are in just a little bit. How do we know or measure groundwater? Well, it might seem odd, but one of the biggest ways that we measure groundwater is through satellite measurements. And that should be right? We've got these satellites in outer space measuring groundwater, which is below the surface. Well, the way we do it is we look at moisture on the surface, and we also look at gravitational differences, micro gravitational differences on Earth. Now, I would like you to pause the video here and go below the lecture on YouTube or on Canvas, and you will find a link to this video here. Please watch it. You're going to be learning about the GRACE satellite, which is a satellite constellation that is run through NASA and USGS and Jet Propulsion Lab and all these other federal entities within the United States. That is a pretty incredible resource for understanding how groundwater changes across the world. So as we mentioned before, groundwater moves very slowly compared to surface water. If we remember back to our lab 1, right, we were looking at discharge in Little Niagara Creek, and we were considering that discharge in meters per second. But if we remember back to our groundwater table from a little bit earlier on in the lecture, we were looking at that rate of movement on meters per day, or in some cases, millimeters or centimeters per day. So there's a big change when you consider how fast something is moving through rock or sand and soil versus how fast something is moving on the surface of the planet. Here we can look, and this is just an idea of groundwater movement in years versus centuries versus millennia. Depending on how far down it goes, that increases its residency time, right? So for the most part, the more you infiltrate into that subsurface, the longer you're going to be within that system, and the longer it's going to take for you to get back out of that system. From years if you're just in the shallow subsurface to millennia if you're deep underground. And here we can see this is just to re-show those porosity and permeability values for different materials. So for permeability, which is really important for how water flows through the subsurface, if you're a granite, you're moving at millimeters per day. If you're a sandy or gravelly material, you're moving at 205 meters per day. So a very big difference in how things move and how water moves through the pore spaces in materials underground. We've got aquifers and aquitards. An aquifer can include a unconfined aquifer, which is basically open to the surface. So there's nothing preventing water from infiltrating at the surface and percolating down into the an unconfined aquifer. So those typically, you've got high porosity and permeability, so there's a lot of good space and a lot of space for water to move through. You've got confined aquifers. Those are ones that lie beneath an aquitard or an aquiclude, things that prevent water from moving in. Water in an in a confined aquifer is being supplied from somewhere else, and it's existing in this below the subsurface, usually positioned between a couple different aquitards or aquicludes, which allow water to kind of nestle in these little packages in our subsurface. Then we've got our aquitards, and these are just relatively impermeable sediment packages that prevent water from moving through. If we look at the arrows of the unconfined aquifer, once they get here, they start to turn, right? They're not able to work their way down, right? It just doesn't work. It's a big old X right there. So what texture makes the best aquifer? Well, we're thinking of how fast sediment moves in and whatnot. Maybe something like a sand. And what texture makes the best aquitard? Well, maybe something like a clay, right? It takes a long time for water to work through a clay, even though there's a decent amount of pore space there, but that lack of permeability really sets it off compared to something like a sand. So what about our saturated zone here? Well, we know there are these different kinds of aquifers defined as a function of their connectedness to the surface. Unconfined aquifers, they're exposed to water infiltrating through the surface. Confined aquifers, not so much. Aquifers have inputs, what we call aquifer recharge. And that can be either water percolating through the soil or supplied by exotic streams. In an unconfined aquifer, we see it something like this, right? There's nothing preventing water from getting into the groundwater zone. So it hits the surface, congregates on the surface, percolates or infiltrates and percolates down, and you're supplying water to your unconfined aquifer. In a confined aquifer, your recharge area might be somewhere completely different. And here we notice it's over this mountainous area, right? But there's an aquiclude, so maybe some very fine-grained sediment that's preventing the movement of water through the surface into the subsurface. So water is instead rushing off if it's flowing, rather than percolating down through and into that surface down there. So here we see an aquiclude, right? This is one of those features, a little bit more intense than an aquitard. Kind of the same concept. I would consider an aquitard one that prevents water, and aquiclude is one that keeps it out or keeps it confined wholly. They're kind of the same concept though. So here your recharge area is up top. It rains on these mountains, and finds its way into the subsurface here. Sometimes where you have things like faulting or whatnot, you can actually have water seeping up, and we have what's called artesian wells or artesian springs that can form in those joints and faults within your bedrock. We've kind of touched on all of this, right? Why a confined aquifer? Well, less permeable materials such as clays, that's what we call an aquitard. Confining impermeable rock layers, that's what we call an aquiclude. And those are kind of keeping sediment or water from moving through some layer of sediment and getting into the confined aquifer. All right. What about outputs? Aquifer discharge as either base flow or springs. Sometimes it goes to plants under some conditions if they have particularly deep taproots. We'll get into that a little bit later in the biome section, though. So what are some of the big prominent ones here? And some of the ones that are most important to us. The Ogallala High Plains Aquifer is one of them. You might have heard about this in some experiences or some news stories that the Ogallala High Plains Aquifer is being severely depleted. Here we can see it extending from South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, pardon me, I'm sorry, and Texas. It's confined, its aquiclude is this tertiary bedrock and upper Cretaceous bedrock that you see here. We see this thin veneer of other sediment on top of it, and then the Ogallala High Plains Aquifer is below that. So the recharge is up here in the North Platte River, kind of right over here. That's its recharge zone, is right up here in the North Platte. Here is an example of modeling endeavors to look at depletion and drawdown within the Ogallala Aquifer. Currently, the red is depleted landscapes, and the yellow is estimated to be depleted by 2050, and the bluish green depleted by 2150. Why? Well, we'll get into it in a little bit later. Just a little, another 5 or 10 minutes or so when we talk about what's happening within groundwater depletion and why some of the practices we're doing out here are not sustainable. But agriculture is one of the primary reasons, and we'll dive into that here in just a little bit. So groundwater and stream flow, remember I mentioned exotic streams versus perennial streams. So we call these, depending on the stream, effluent with an EF or influent with an IN. So if you're in a humid climate, you're dealing with effluent conditions. Your water table is being expressed as a perennial stream on the surface. So it's adding flow to the river. So in effluent case, you're adding water through base flow, which is kind of seeping through the soil into the stream. In an influent, IN, in a dry climate with an influent condition, you're losing water, as we see by our arrows here, to the groundwater zone. So it's flowing out of the stream. And the exotic aspect comes from the fact that these rivers aren't always flowing under the same conditions that they were formed. The Nile, and we'll talk about this, the Nile and the Colorado here in a little bit, are completely different in their headwaters than they are in Egypt or Arizona, for example. For effluent streams, typically 40% of the stream is base flow, so groundwater derived discharge. And most streams receive runoff and base flow inputs, so combined aspects of both. Not all, but most. This changes once you get into the more arid and semi-arid regions out west, and we'll talk about that. But one way you can characterize these is base flow is what we call cool, clean, steady, and oxygenated. It's moving through the surface. It's not affected by the heat that is affecting the surface, so it's nice and cool. The subsurface basically acts to filter it, so it's clean, it's steady, it's a constant trickle for the most part. It doesn't rapidly change, and it's oxygenated or well oxygenated. Runoff dominated systems are what we call much flashier. So you have rainfall, it rushes over the surface, your stream goes from flowing a decent bit to flowing a lot and then flowing back down to a decent bit after the flood has moved through. So in these runoff dominated systems, this component of flashiness is a big deal. Now, when you have more runoff, you can have more frequent and more severe flooding. Here, we're looking at a prime case of this. This is the Chippewa River in April of this year. We had one of the biggest floods on record. Not the biggest, but one of the bigger ones. And we can see on the left, that's Chippewa Falls. On the right, that is Owen Park, just across from campus here, by the tennis courts when you cross over the footbridge. Mostly underwater. Typically, this tree line here is where the river ends. So you can see there's a lot of water here. And this wasn't even, I don't think this was even at its highest stage. I think it got up a little bit further, maybe back here. So more runoff, you have more frequent, more severe flooding. And runoff versus groundwater flow or base flow is typically warmer. It's being affected by temperatures on the surface rather than cooler temperatures underground. It's sediment laden. It's carrying a bunch of stuff with it as it's rushing over the surface. It's nutrient enriched oftentimes. Here we see an example of this person in a farm field. So obviously things like fertilizers have been applied there. There's a lot more organic material, so it's more nutrient enriched. And it's poorly oxygenated because it's going to be warmer. There's less oxygen available within that system. More things are consuming that oxygen. So from a water quality perspective, runoff dominated systems are going to be much lower water quality than base flow dominated systems, because the base flow dominated stuff is basically filtered out by our groundwater or by our subsurface. So influent streams, moving away from the effluent stuff, is a stream that loses water to the groundwater zone, as I mentioned. Exotic streams, such as the Nile and the Colorado, are prime examples of influent streams. They're losing water once they get past the point where they're forming to the groundwater zone, and the water table kind of comes up to the stream rather than adding into the stream. So the water is flowing away from the stream. It's losing discharge as it goes downstream. All other things considered, compared to perennial streams, which water is being added. Here's an example of our very own exotic stream, the Nile. The headwaters in the mountainous regions in Colorado and Wyoming and the Rockies, where snow melt and much wetter conditions are adding water to this system. But by the time you get to Arizona and the Colorado flows through Grand Canyon and down through into the Gulf of Mexico, it's flowing through arid to semi-arid environments. And in those environments, it's losing that ground or that water to its groundwater. This is an example of what something like an influent stream would look like. Who cares, right? We live in an area where we are very fortunate to have a lot of water, surplus of water on the surface. Well, about 50% of the water source for the United States, 50% of our drinking water comes from groundwater. So if we have issues with our groundwater, we have issues with our source of drinking water, and that's a really big concern. There are two main problems, groundwater mining and groundwater contamination. We're going to step through both of those and the issues that come out of both of them as well. So when you have groundwater depletion, one of the big things, if you're in a coastal zone, that can happen is you have saline intrusions of water into your freshwater supply. So typically in a natural system, you've got this kind of relationship where your salt water, your salty groundwater drops off the further inland you get, right? Just like that. Now, if you put a municipal district in there or a metropolitan area and you add wells and you're drawing that freshwater supply, well, we see it drops off here. And then once you pull enough of that fresh water, you start to reduce your groundwater supply and you start to pull in some of that saline or salty water from the ocean. When you do that, well, you're polluting your freshwater drinking supply, and that water is no longer good to drink. This is a really big problem and concern in New Orleans right now. I'm not sure if anyone's seen those news stories, but one of the things you might have seen recently was concerns that the Mississippi River, which is at very low flow conditions right now, is being inundated by salt water from the Gulf of Mexico. And that salt water, which is denser and a little bit different temperatures, pushing its way up. It's wedging its way up the Mississippi River Delta. And concerns are that it's going to pollute the groundwater supply for the city of New Orleans and other proximal cities. Here's an example that we can see. This is from circulation quite a while ago in Biscayne Bay, looking at salt concentrations. We see them moving inland, and this is chloride concentration, so NaCl, moving inland from Biscayne Bay. So we can see how that salt water kind of forces its way, right, into areas where if you were to put a well here, well, you're at risk for polluting your groundwater supply. Flow reversal is another big problem. So regional groundwater has a typical flow. As we said, it follows elevational differences, so it flows from high to low elevation, like we see here. Now, let's say we have a small well in this house right here. And let's unfortunately say that that well is leaking contaminants. This is a septic tank, so it's leaking poo and other waste materials. Fun, right? So let's say somebody moves in next door and puts a high capacity well or a large irrigation well and starts to draw that water. Well, what happens then is your water starts to flow towards the low elevation point. And that low elevation point is now here. Uh-oh, problem, right? Because then that low elevation is going to flow back towards you and your well, and, well, then your fecal coliform levels are about to skyrocket. And that's not good, is it? Another big issue is aquifer collapse. So if you're depleting that groundwater, you are depleting the water that's applying pressure in the pore spaces of the sediment that it's existing in. It's exerting an outward pressure, and as it exerts that outward pressure, it maintains a certain status quo. Now you take that water away, and that can lead to compaction of your sediment. As it leads to compaction of that sediment, it can do things like fissure on the surface. We see these fissures and cracks and things developing through here. Sounds weird, right? Well, it's happening. When I was living in Phoenix for my PhD, on the eastern basin, so the eastern side of the Phoenix Basin, so Mesa, so far eastern Mesa, and some of the other cities over there, we're dealing with with fissures related to groundwater drawdown in the eastern basin, where you would have they'd be a few meters deep and hundreds of meters long cracks that would open up. That would go right through roads. They would go under buildings. They would go through open fields. And this is a big problem that they're trying to deal with. But they've drawn so much water that there's really no way to combat that other than stop drawing the water. So severe water table decline can also alter surface water flows. So groundwater depletion can lead to other issues of streams and wetlands drying up. And then you're degrading vital habitat for any number of species. So that can lead to a lot of issues if you're pumping, for example, in this example we see here, if you're pumping a bunch of water and changing that regional groundwater flow direction, well, your river and swamp just became dry. And all the creatures that need to call that home don't have a home anymore. So one of the big features that exists is this thing called a cone of depression. And it's a cone because we're not dealing with two-dimensional things, even though we're looking at figures in two-dimensional ways. This cone of depression is something that forms all around your well, and that's where water is being drawn down to a certain point, and the water table is adjusting to that. So here we can see the water table before pumping commenced. There we can see the water table after pumping commenced, and obviously this is a cone of depression, so that extends all the way back and through the photo here, something along those lines. It's a three-dimensional feature. Now, over time, that big well is going to draw water down all the way to its level. If it's lower than your municipal well that feeds your house that you're right next to, well, your well is left high and dry. Another problem. We look at groundwater change in the United States from 2003 to 2012. We can see some pretty big trends, right? If we look here, significant depletion and groundwater basically below this line, even in most of Minnesota and parts of northern Wisconsin. So we're talking centimeters per year of storage rate decreasing. Some of the worst in the Houston, Galveston, Dallas-Fort Worth area, throughout much of Mississippi, throughout the Ogallala High Plains Aquifer, which is what this is here. All of these are big concerns. Now, what's driving a lot of these? Well, one of them is what we're seeing here before us. Points to you if you know what this is. Fake points like they used in Whose Line Is It Anyways? Not real points, of course, but this is what we call a false color image. So instead of combining red, green, and blue, which is what our eyes typically see in, they're combining near infrared, which is something our eyes can't really see that well, but is expressed in shades of red, and then red and blue bands. And what this does is it makes vegetation pop out really well. Red, in this case, is vegetation. Depending on how bright that looks, some vegetation is healthier than others, or it might be different types of vegetation. Here it is as well. You might have seen these. We have them here in Wisconsin, not very often, but you might have seen something that looks like this sprinkler system, this irrigation system. This is something called central pivot irrigation. So there's a well right in the center of the field that is pumping water to all of these arms that go out and rotate in a big old circle. And as they do, they water the crops. So central pivot irrigation leads to these circular patterns in farm fields. If you look anywhere in the West, you will see them everywhere, quite literally everywhere. Um, and then you'll have a nice, fun thing to tell your friends that, oh, I know what those circles are. So there's another party fact for all of you. Elsewhere, we're seeing other issues with groundwater drawdown, like sinkholes. So this is catastrophic subsidence in central Florida. So basically here, enough water has been drawn down, there's a cavity under the earth, and it all collapses in. And if you have a house there or a garage, you're having a very, very bad and very expensive day. Here we can see another example of one. This boat was aptly placed. I'll give them credit for that. Another big one here. And this terrifying example was from Guatemala City. This opened up in 2010 because of subsidence of the land and a big sewer leak. And this goes down quite a ways. I've seen the top downs. It's even more terrifying than it looks. So here's some of the examples of why that happens. You can have either natural erosion of the surface. So we start here. Notice how much surface is present, right? By the time we get here, land has been eroded away. There's much less space, and then it collapses in on itself. That can happen. Groundwater withdrawal, you're basically leaving a cavity in the subsurface by depleting all of that water. That can lead to that reduction in pore pressure and collapse of that sinkhole. And then surface loading. If you put enough stuff on top of the surface, well, you're basically crushing the sediment and it leads to fractures and it falls down. Big problem. Now, subsidence is a really big issue in a lot of different places. Here we see Houston and Galveston, Texas. This is subsidence estimates for quite a while ago, but we can see, notice that our subsidence contours are in feet. That means 9 feet at its maximum, somewhere between 9 and 10 feet of subsidence in the Houston, Texas area because of groundwater depletion. And if that sounds like a lot, let me floor you a little bit, because here is the exact same kind of thing, subsidence in the Central Valley of California. You can see these are not small, right? These are 30-foot, maybe 40-foot poles, somewhere along those lines. That I would estimate as a 6-foot tall person. And, and we can see in 1925, that's where the surface used to be. And this is 1977, so obviously it's changed since then. So it has changed a ridiculous amount. And in its maximum, the darkest red here in the San Joaquin Valley area, right about here, is somewhere over 10 feet or 3 meters. Here we can see it's substantially larger than that. We're talking tens of meters of change. If you're living in a coastal city, this is an even bigger problem. Here we see a news story from 2022 in January. Indonesia names new capital Nusantara, replacing sinking Jakarta. Government offices will relocate to province of East Kalimantan, easing burdens on the Java metropolis as it battles environmental problems. What environmental problems? Well, add in relative sea level rise or absolute sea level rise, so the amount of water absolutely expanding and changing in sea level rise over the entire globe, you have more and more issues. Now, our oceans we have rising sea levels. It's coming from a couple of different places. Thermal expansion. As fluids heat up, they expand. And as water or air heats up, they expand. So thermal expansion of our oceans and the addition of more water that has been locked up in our cryosphere, so our zone of ice and snow, are leading to a lot of changes in absolute sea level rise. If you are places like Tokyo or Jakarta or Manila or Bangkok, Ho Chi Minh City, or the West Netherlands, you're having a bad time. Now, let's compare this to kind of some relative perspectives. So sea level rise is this line up top, right? You need to look at the difference between that line and the subsidence rates to get an idea of how much change is happening over a given place. If we've got upwards of 4.25 meters of subsidence in Tokyo, and we've got another half meter or so of sea level rise, well, you're getting towards 5 meters of change. That is a lot of change to be dealing with if you're a coastal city trying to live. One of the next problems is groundwater contamination. So here we see a series of non-point source and point source pollution. So things like city streets, suburban development, wastewater treatment, factories, animal feedlots, cropland, and rural homes all add pollution into our water supply, which obviously through the hydrologic cycle gets into our groundwater supply as well. Things like industrial chemicals, landfill leachates, domestic and municipal chemicals, agricultural chemicals, and livestock waste all contribute to groundwater contamination. So this was a little figure put out by United States Geological Survey. So 115 million people rely on groundwater for drinking water. 43 million people rely on groundwater from private wells. 1 out of every 5 groundwater samples from over 6,600 wells sampled were contaminated from geologic or human sources at a level exceeding a potential human health concern. That should scare you because that's a problem, right? That's the things that you're trying to drink. If we look at another USGS figure, we're looking at from geologic and human sources. This is from the same publication as the previous slide was. And these are exceedances of human health benchmarks by 1 or more contaminants. A lot from geologic sources, but also a lot from human sources, depending on where you are. If you are dealing with the Cambrian Ordovician deposits here in Wisconsin, in one of our aquifers here, you've got a good proportion of geologic and human sources, somewhat similar to the average across all of them. If you're living in the Columbia Plateau, you're dealing with substantial pollution from human sources. Same if you're in the North Atlantic coastal plain or the Mississippian aquifer or the Biscayne, which we looked at earlier on, or the surficial aquifer. All of these are dealing with widespread human contamination. Here we could look at groundwater susceptibility in Wisconsin. I apologize for the color schema here. Red-green color blindness is an issue that I typically try to avoid this color scheme, but this came out in 1989, so we're going to give them some grace. Now, if we were dealing with mostly unconfined, thin glacial outwash, we would be dealing with areas that are most susceptible to contamination. If we were dealing with mostly confined bedrock, we would be dealing with the least amount of contamination. Places like here, the shores of Lake Superior or the shores of Lake Michigan, significantly less susceptibility to groundwater contamination. Almost everywhere else, particularly here home along the Chippewa River Valley, we see it here, lots of issues with potential erosion or potential groundwater susceptibility to unconfined aquifers because of this thin glacial outwash. So these are mostly unconfined. The bedrock is mostly confined. Makes sense, right? So we should be starting to see this continental scale pattern of North America emerging. So the next number of slides, we're going to be drawing a map. Here's the start of that map. Now this is very, very important. We're going to be doing 4 of these maps. We're going to be doing 1 for water as a resource. We're going to be doing 1 for climate. We're going to be doing 1 for biomes. And we're going to be doing 1 for soils. So get used to this. I would suggest, highly suggest you flip back to a page in your notebook, in the back of your notebook, and sketch this out on a full page. First off, draw in the coasts. We're going to be drawing in this nice arcuate feature from the Aleutian Peninsula all the way down the coast of British Columbia, the western coast of the United States, and the Baja Peninsula into Mexico. We're going to draw the Gulf of Mexico, draw a nice little knob for Florida. I do not expect you to be artists. You can see I am not. All the way up the east coast into areas like New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island and past New England and whatnot. Also draw in Hudson Bay, which is this little feature right here. So get those in there. Add this line. This is the 100th meridian. So this is the line that we are going to basically say denotes a shift from the humid east to the arid west. So draw that line in. Throw the Great Lakes in there, give them their due. And then throw the 3 dominant mountain ranges. So the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, and the coastal ranges in there. Get those all in. All right, once you've got all this, go ahead and advance to the next slide. Now, draw out a column on either side. You've got the arid west, you've got the humid east. All right, once you've got that, go ahead and advance. So here is a look at average precipitation across the United States. Hey, look at that, roughly right about there. Our 100th meridian is that line separating the east from the west. So over the arid west, we've got inadequate precipitation input. Over the humid east, we have plenty of precipitation input. And we could throw this map underneath just so you can get a good idea of what that looks like. All right, once you've got that, we're going to go ahead and advance and look at aquifers, right? So here's our major regional aquifer systems in dark blue, our important complex aquifers in the tealish green, and local minor aquifers in the other color. All right, we're going to look at that area, North America, right? So we see the Ogallala, the California Central Valley Aquifer System, Gulf Coastal Plains Aquifer, and then a bunch of regional and local minor aquifers throughout that as well. Okay, so again, if we were to draw our little line here, well, we could come up with some decent approximations for what aquifer setup across the states are like. On the west, plenty of big aquifers, lots of storage. In the east, much smaller aquifers and spottier storage, which leads to some other problems like pollution. Now, I don't have a good, unfortunately, there's not really a good groundwater pollution potential for the entire United States. So we're looking at a map of American air pollution to give us an idea. Our systems are connected. Air pollution, water pollution, groundwater pollution, they're all kind of cycling. And we're looking at areas like the Rust Belt right here and the breadbasket as well. So a lot more potential sources for contamination. So from a pollution perspective, we could say there's little contamination from industry or agriculture out west, although that is increasing in areas like San Francisco and Los Angeles and Seattle and all these other regions. Out east, lots of contamination and in the form of industry and agriculture. We can see that there. All right, water scarcity. What's water conditions going to be like, or what are they like? What are our projected outlooks? Water supply projections, not comforting in the Southwest, particularly. Out west, not great. Southwest, really bad. And out east, water supply projections are less optimistic than most people think. We're still dealing with issues. Out west, it comes from a growing population and expanding industry. Out east, it comes from a growing demand for food and continuing groundwater contamination because it's a lot easier to pollute these groundwater sources. So that is it, pardon me, for this lecture. Thank you for bearing with me as I'm attending a conference and driving down there right now. Please make sure you know all this material. We're going to pick right back up with climate on Tuesday, so we're not really going to recap much of this. We're going to please have watched this. I will be posting the part 2 or the first of our 4 study guides. Like I mentioned, I release them incrementally, so I'll release the first of those here today or tomorrow. So Thank you all very much. I hope you have a great weekend. I will see you all on Tuesday. Please be ready for the lab exam, which is coming up. So have a great day, everyone. Thanks.